My name is Mark Spalding. I'm a senior marine scientist with the Nature Conservancy. I'm also an honorary research fellow in the zoology department in Cambridge, but as you can probably see, I actually live in Italy on an organic farm. What I'm going to talk to you today, though, is about the marine environment and about the need and use of innovation. And by innovation, I think I mean both innovation of technology and innovation of ideas as well. I'm going to talk quite a bit about coral reefs, and in a series of talks about ocean optimism, some of you might raise your eyebrows almost immediately because coral reefs, as many of us know, are under particular threat, it seems, from climate change. But over the years, they've been hit by a sort of almost a war of attrition of pollution and overfishing and so on and development. So coral reefs at a global scale are certainly in a bit of a parlous state at the moment, but like many ecosystems, there's a sort of heterogeneity within them, and some reefs are certainly faring much better than others. And as conservationists, a critical need for us is to know what's happening, how it works, to get the data and to be able to act nimbly, fast, to make changes to do the conservation. A lesson I learned very early on in my career, in fact kind of before it even began really, was that there's not enough scientists to go around. I was doing some sort of fairly amateur, I suppose, expeditions to study coral reefs around the world, and it was pretty obvious that no matter where I went, I could find stuff that was needed by science. That was also brought home to me by one of the then bigwigs in the Cambridge conservation world, as we were planning a very different expedition to the rainforests in Ghana, and we were told by this chap, look, do whatever you want to do, count your moths and your dragonflies and so on, look at your quadrats, but make sure that when you come home, you tell us everything you saw. Because we were going to a place where no other conservation scientists had been, and a chance sighting of a Diana monkey or a spot-nosed guenon or something like that will put that creature and that place on the map and enable us to better make conservation priorities. So it wasn't long after that that I began my work mapping the world's coral reefs, really for the first time. And although obviously satellites were up there and taking imagery, the cost of the imagery and the processing of the imagery was still prohibitive. So I became something of a parasite, and I used other people's data. We coalesced maps from around the world, particularly navigational charts. And this lack of knowledge was pretty apparent even then. You could see some of these charts from the Pacific Ocean particularly. You'd see dotted lines and it would say discoloration reported 1879 or something like that. What it was that a big sailing vessel was probably in the vicinity and noticed over in the distance perhaps a patch of lighter coloured water, brownish water, and thought coral reef. Now for them a coral reef was an obstacle. It could eviscerate a ship and kill all on board. So they noted it down on the chart, and for 150 years afterwards, every single vessel in the vicinity steered well clear of those patches. But it was extraordinary to me that there were still those patches, gaps in our knowledge. Anyway, we produced this first world map of coral reefs, which was already something. But that knowledge of where things were, at least roughly, was also super important in telling wider stories. And in parallel, we worked on something called Reefs at Risk, where we tried to produce the first map of the threats to coral reefs. Now, what everyone already knew, we were hearing stories that coral reefs were in trouble from place to place, different stories, overfishing, blast fishing, pollution, tourist development, whatever it might be. Coral reefs were struggling, but those were little itty-bitty stories from here and there. What we sought to do and did with Reefs at Risk was to create a global homogeneous map. It was a model, but it was pretty good. We produced this report and we sent it out, and it had a remarkable impact. It was sent out to politicians, to journalists. It made the front page of multiple newspapers. I was on breakfast television, which is exciting, I suppose. And about 3 or 4 days after it came out, I got a phone call from one of the UK politicians, a chap called Tam Diel, who said to me in this sort of gruff voice, "Mark, we've got a debate tabled in Parliament about your report. I need you to give me some questions for the Prime Minister by tomorrow, please." And, you know, that is influence that conservationists die for. We got coral reefs into the public parlance, into the parlance of governments. And I think that report, among other things, helped us to push coral reefs up a notch in terms of public concern, funding and conservation measures. So my optimism, if you like, there isn't that coral reefs were doing well. In fact, coral reefs were doing badly. But with good knowledge, we could start to spread the information and start to instigate change. Obviously, more than 20 years have passed since that report. Now we're on the third global map of coral reefs still coming out, the Allen Coral Atlas, entirely from satellite imagery. We've also mapped mangroves with satellite imagery. I'm delighted to say Tom Worthington in the zoology department is now working on a global map of salt marshes. So we can do the coastal stuff quite well. Satellites don't look very deep in the water, but we're also people are starting to map seamounts, deep water coral reefs, chemosynthetic communities, cold seeps, thermal vents, stuff that we didn't even know existed, some of it 50 years ago, but we're now putting it on the map, and that knowledge is really very critical. And I'm pleased to say that really with technology, we're starting to get there. So the next sort of story I want to tell is really about how we start to use information to leverage change. So data's already all well and good, but I think we need to go beyond data towards sort of activation and to move us into areas where perhaps we're not always comfortable as conservationists. For the last 10 years or so, I've been working on a project, or a series of projects really, which we've called Mapping Ocean Wealth. And what we've sought to do is to try and understand the value of nature to people. Of course, nature's value to people is well known, whether it's the sourcing of drugs and pharmaceuticals, or the food we eat, or the role of nature in protecting our coasts from erosion, producing fish, so on. We've known this for a long time, but the science has never been quite there in a strong enough place to deliver action and change in terms of how we manage natural resources. So we set up this project really with the intention of trying to tell those stories in a more holistic manner. Once again, I think perhaps parasitizing other people's research, we realized that while there's never enough data, there's never enough science, that there was enough to get on with. So we've began with a series, almost a modular approach, with a series of studies that looked at the role of oysters in cleaning waters in estuaries, the role of coral reefs and mangrove forests in attenuating waves to reduce erosion and flooding, the role of multiple habitats in generating fish, almost like fish factories, the carbon storage potential of different coastal habitats and so on. And we began to build these out from the field studies of scientists into regional or even global maps and stories with values attached. Now, the term value sometimes puts shivers down the spines of some environmentalists, but values for us is a broad term. So it might be tons of carbon stored in mangrove forests. It might be kilograms of fish supplied to fishers. It might be jobs. It might be, of course, it might be money. It might be the spending of tourists. The story I want to pick out in particular is some work we've been doing around tourism. Everyone knows that coral reefs are a bit of a magnet for tourists, and yet there were no hard numbers, and we felt we could get there. The only numbers we could get on the value of tourism in the 100 plus countries with coral reefs were national statistics, numbers of arrivals and their expenditure. So that was our starting point. We thought, well, how can we refine that? How can we fairly assign some of that money to the coral reefs, which are drawing some people to visit those countries? And we got, I think, quite ingenious about it. We took those national numbers and we spread them using a couple of different layers. We used the hotel rooms where they were, and we also used photographs uploaded onto a big public database, Flickr, which you may have heard of. And those gave us a sort of spread of where people were taking photographs or staying in rooms, and we used that as a sort of way of spreading the value, the expenditure and the numbers of visitors across entire countries. We then looked at reef proximity, and we calling all of the time really, on experts and drawing on the literature to see what was fair to assign. We then got other data sets involved. We used a global user-generated dive sites layer and a dive centres layer. We went back into Flickr and we pulled out tens of thousands of underwater photographs. And those were geolocated photographs where we knew the exact location the photograph was taken. So suddenly you can see what we were doing. We weren't really using the scientists to tell us what was happening. We were using public user-generated content to see where things were. From that work, and it was a fairly sort of long process, we got to a map and a model and some numbers. $36 billion per year were being generated just because of coral reefs. And we could see not only that, but we could map it. 70 countries in the world had what we called $1 million reefs, where every square kilometre in a $1 million reef is generating $1 million per year for that country in terms of tourism expenditure. So these were pretty exciting values. And we not only knew that, but we took it to the reefs themselves, because we had the dive sites and we had the underwater photographs. We could pinpoint which reefs were generating those numbers. We won an award for that work. It was quite exciting. More importantly, we've got people using it. I've been consulted quite a few times now, and a colleague of mine is working with the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, who found that our data is the best data they've got for looking at the tourism use intensity of their coral reefs. So getting real data at a global scale of practical use on the ground was pretty exciting for us. The work doesn't stop there, and we start to move towards innovation a little bit more. We're still experimenting with this. We're working with Microsoft and with TripAdvisor to look at the coral reefs in some of the Caribbean countries, and we're using artificial intelligence. We're reading people's reviews to find out what it is they saw and what they liked and what they did. We're finding more photographs, again using artificial intelligence to identify the underwater photographs, which are dominated by certain shades of blue and certain structures and so on. And it's pretty impressive what you can start to see. So we're starting now to pick out not only dive sites, but also nature-dependent beaches, kayaking and paddleboarding, people going recreational fishing, photographs of person holding fish, that kind of stuff. Artificial intelligence can read the photographs, it can read the text and find out what people did. So it's pretty exciting, because it's enabling us to really start to pinpoint these values. And it's our hope really that those values turned into maps, turned into actual numbers, can hold their ground. And if you think about marine space at the moment, whereas before it was kind of the edge of the unknown, people are jostling for space in the marine environment at the moment. There are obviously still people hoping to fish, there's oil and gas, there's aggregates extractions. We've got vessels now going into the deep sea trying to mine deep ocean sediments for rare earth metals. We've got aquaculture, we've got shipping lanes, we've got renewable energy trying to set up platforms. So there's a jostling for space. And if we're going to try and make a case for looking after and carefully managing the marine and coastal environment, we're going to need our data to be at the table using the same currency that all of these other uses are using. And so it's very important that we join in this game, and I think we're starting to do that. And I'm quite optimistic that there's much more we can do in this area. So the final part of the stories I want to tell is to think about how we start to scale up and how we start to really affect change. So it's about new approaches to really get some traction, and with new partners. A few years ago, because of the Mapping Ocean Wealth work, I found myself at The Economist magazine's Global Ocean Summit, and I found myself in strange companies that I've always sort of rather shunned in the past, bankers and economists. And I think maybe I'd always seen them as almost the enemy, but what I very quickly found was that at this meeting there was a real interest in what we were doing and an enthusiasm to help. And it struck me immediately that and they told me there's tons of money out there ready to be used, ready to be loaned, if you can only give us the projects. Now, this isn't money to be given. It's not donations that we sometimes get as NGOs. This is about using money from investors, sometimes from big funds, trust funds, pension funds, to generate change. And at the core of this really is a certain group of investors, which we could call impact investors, people who aren't necessarily after the biggest returns. They want their money back, they want a low level of interest, but they're prepared to loan to something that they might see even as a good cause. So that struck my interest immediately. But a few years ago, colleagues of mine were working with the Seychelles government on what in fact wasn't a new idea, a debt for nature swap, they used to be called. This is the idea of adjusting or readjusting a sovereign debt from a country So many of the world's countries have huge debts. The idea behind a debt readjustment is something like it's like a remortgaging of your house or a changing of your mortgage lender. So the idea is you'll find a favourable rate. Now, any country can do this on their own, but it's hard work. What an organisation such as mine can do is it can bring both expertise and people who, in a sense, are neutral, who have access to both good economists and maybe some of these funds, and particular access to some of these impact investors who might be interested in spending their money, but they're not going to deal directly with a sovereign nation. So the idea in the Seychelles was if we could restructure the debt to save the country a large amount of money, and with these debt restructurings you might change it to the local currency instead of US dollars, you might also extend the term of the repayments and so on. That would be great for the Seychelles government. We would then try and set up something in return that would appeal to us and to the impact investors, which would enable a very large-scale change in conservation. And the deal that we struck with the Seychelles was 30% of your marine space will be put into marine protected areas, a large part of that to be strict marine protected areas where there's no fishing allowed whatsoever. So the deal is complicated, it takes a long time. You have to keep these things actually under wraps, because the moment investors hear that a country's renegotiating its debts, it sends jitters through the markets. You've got to work the deal almost behind the scenes for a long time. You've got to make sure every piece is in place. You don't want to just have this benefit of financial benefit without the security, the long-term security of protection. So you need to set up an endowment and an organisation independent of government that's going to manage this endowment and manage the protection. So all that gets worked out almost behind the scenes. And then when a deal is looking pretty good, there's a draft deal, it's announced, it might be debated in Parliament, and then it's put into practice. And in the Seychelles, that involved intensive engagement of all the local people, so it wasn't a sort of top-down thing. There was a lot of involvement in marine spatial planning. But eventually, and the last piece was slotted into place last year, 410,000 square kilometres of the Seychelles marine space was declared as protected. Now that's an area bigger than Germany, the size of Greenland, that was set aside through this debt restructuring process. That's pretty good. But what's happening now is that the Nature Conservancy has, with the support of TED and an audacious project, is trying to scale that up. We believe in the next few years we can do at least 10 more deals like that. So we're moving in a sense from protecting a Germany-sized or a Greenland-sized chunk of the ocean space into something more like a small continent, setting aside millions of square kilometres of the ocean as marine protected areas that will benefit not only biodiversity but also people, fishers and tourists and so on. So it's a really exciting project that I think has real potential to grow and grow. I mean, 10 more countries is great, but there's probably 80 countries that might be open to this kind of debt renegotiation, which could have huge impacts. So to try and pull some of this together, I think what I'm trying to say is that nature conservation needs to move into the future. I think a lot of nature conservation in the past has been about a reactive response to things that are going wrong in the planet and fighting a rearguard action. We've made incredible progress. Protected areas cover large tracts of the planet. Legal regimes are helping to protect many of our natural resources. But we need to start to be more proactive. And to do that, we need information. We need a lot of data. We need to, but once we've got the data, we also need models to help us to fill the gaps in the data and to start to look at the future. We need technology. We need technology to tell us what's happening, a good resolution in near real time, and we need to be open to taking on new ideas. My point of optimism is that I think we're moving very fast towards that situation, and I'm excited about that. I think we need to challenge the challengers, and to do that, sometimes the people creating problems for the world might be governments or developers or economists or businesses. We might need to use their terms, take them on their own ground, and I think we can, because I think with good data we're strong enough to do that. If people, when I turn on the internet, know what I'm looking at, know what I'm taking photographs of, know what I'm buying, know where I'm going, perhaps we can start to use artificial intelligence too. And maybe it's more than just looking at what people took photographs of. Maybe it's reading their minds. And the idea of opinion mining is something that we're increasingly starting to think about. So you can see not only the photograph they took, but what they thought of it by reading their reviews and understanding their feelings. So it's pretty exciting. Strangely enough, I consider myself a bit of a Luddite. For me, my passion for nature is much more based on this. It's about getting into nature and getting my fix. And for me, that's the real value of nature. But I'm also a pragmatist and a realist. And I know that not everyone feels like that. And we can't just rely on goodwill and good feelings to get us to where we need to get to. So we need to think about being innovative. And I think that's exactly what we're doing. So I'm looking forward to seeing a future where we start to use more and more of these new techniques, new ideas, new data sets and new approaches. Thanks.